All right, welcome back, everybody. Picking up right where we left off last night's PowerPoint, Age of Absolutism Part 5, moving into the Age of Absolutism Part 6, and figuring out what in the world is going to happen to the throne of Russia after Peter the Great died. Well, just as you guessed it, he passed it on. The throne of Russia was then passed on to Peter's wife. Remember, Catherine, who he had fallen in love with, she was his co-ruler, so she would just pick up where he left off. She died, however, 2 years later, 2 years after Peter, and so the young son of Alexei, the one who was killed, so this is Peter and Catherine's grandson, Peter II, is going to become the new Tsar of Russia. Unfortunately, he was able to contract smallpox, and he died at the age of 15. So, as he was dying, the Boyars had Peter II married and tried very hard to have him produce an heir, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. But the Boyars didn't want to create a civil war to determine who the next ruler would be. So no heir was produced, as you might have guessed it, and Peter II died of smallpox a short time later. So who's going to be the next ruler? Well, it's going to get interesting, so let's see if we can keep up. Anna the First. Remember Peter's half-brother Ivan V? She is going to become the new Tsarina because technically by blood she would be next in line to do so. Sophie had died by now, and so this is the next logical ruler. She ruled for 10 years, not much to talk about under her rulership, and she said that her grandnephew Ivan VI is the next rightful heir of Russia. So she declared him the next ruler. However, when Anna died, Ivan was only 1 year old. So how in the world is a 1-year-old going to rule Russia? So Peter the Great's only remaining child was Elizabeth. So he had the son Alexei, and he also had a daughter Elizabeth. And she led a revolution and basically said that he doesn't have the right to rule. My father was the Tsar of Russia. I have the right to rule. And so she had this 1-year-old, Ivan VI, actually thrown into a dungeon. I know, the Russians are crazy. So what happened was Ivan, this 1-year-old infant, was murdered by 15 years later. Elizabeth made sure that this murder took place because she wanted to make sure that he didn't come out of the dungeon or out of exile and try to claim right to the throne. So she really just wanted to secure her place. So Elizabeth, Peter the Great's daughter, actually proved to be a very powerful Tsarina, and she ruled as an absolute monarch for 20 years. We're not going to go into a lot of detail of what she's known for. The main thing you may remember is that she was the one who joined the alliance against Frederick the Great in the 7 Years' War. So under her leadership, the Russian armies were very successful in defeating the Prussians, as you remember from the video we watched in class. And they were even able to make their way all the way towards Berlin, eventually trying to take over Prussia if possible. So when she was getting older and it was becoming more difficult for her to rule, which happened to be in the middle of the 7 Years' War, she chose her nephew, who happened to be Peter III, to be the next heir to the Russian throne. The thing about Peter III you need to understand, though, is that he had a father who happened to be a German prince, and his father died while Peter was still a child. And so he became obsessed with all things German, and he hated all things Russian, which is ironic because now he's going to be the next ruler of Russia and actually fighting against the German province of Prussia in the 7 Years' War. For example, well, first of all, we need to find out who he's going to get married to. We'll get to his personality a little bit later. His aunt, who was the Tsarina before she died, she wanted to arrange a marriage between Peter III and someone who actually happened to be his second cousin, who was also a German princess, and her name was Catherine. Catherine was only 15 years old when they got married, and it was expected, of course, in good, true royalty fashion, that she should produce an heir as soon as possible. The problem was, remember we said Peter was a little strange? He wouldn't touch Catherine. He wouldn't go near her. And instead, he just treated her like a friend, not a wife. In fact, every night when he would go to bed, he would bring toy soldiers to bed with them, and then he'd even have her act out the voices of the enemy soldiers. So it's like they're playing with dolls in bed. Very, very strange, as I mentioned. So eventually, the Russian nobles were starting to get worried because they thought, okay, Peter III is the new czar. There's no heir that's going to be produced. They knew of the relationship between Peter and Catherine, that it was very strange. And so what are they going to do? Well, Catherine's life, you got to put yourself in her shoes. She's ripped from Germany, forced to marry her weird second cousin, and really stuck in a life that she didn't choose for herself. And so she was completely miserable. Well, how is she going to fix that? Well, she decided to start having some relationships with of her own. And in this case, it was going to be with the Russian boyars. And by relationship, I don't just mean friend. And so to the joy of the Russian people, eventually, Catherine finally gave birth. And her child's name is going to be Paul. Don't ask me who the father was, but I can tell you right now, it wasn't Peter. So Peter, as strange as it was, he saw absolutely nothing wrong with the situation, and in fact, actually convinced himself that this was indeed his son. So eventually, Elizabeth, as I mentioned before, she would continue to try to defeat the Prussians as much as possible in the 7 Years' War. The Russian armies were very successful in making it all the way to Berlin. But just as the Russians were on the outskirts of Berlin, right on the outskirts of the capital, suddenly Elizabeth had died and Peter inherited the throne. And Peter immediately signed a peace treaty with Prussia and gave back all of Russia's gains. This, my friends, is what I was talking about before as the miracle of the House of Brandenburg. For whatever reason, it probably has to do with the fact that Peter was German himself, and he had a strange obsession with his father who had died when he was a young age, and he felt no need to continue fighting in this war, and he just basically gave up and said to Frederick and the Prussians, here you go, I'm out. And so that was very, very lucky for Frederick, because it did not look as if Frederick was going to win. And that is why it's considered a miracle. So this saved Frederick the Great and Prussia from complete destruction. Of course, now put yourself in the shoes of the Russian soldiers who had just been fighting this war, this 7 Years' War. They were completely outraged. And of course, it's going to be difficult then for Peter to gain that loyalty of those soldiers. Another thing that he did to make matters even worse is he changed their military uniforms, and he had them wearing Prussian uniforms, so really pouring salt in the wound. Now that his Aunt Elizabeth had died and was completely out of the way, Peter really didn't see any reason for him to have any contact with Catherine, his wife, and so he just stopped talking to her. And so it was at this time that the nobles actually approached Catherine and decided to offer her a proposition. They decided to work out a plan where Peter could be arrested and Catherine could take power. Now, this was going to be both beneficial for the Russian people, because they wouldn't have such a strange ruler anymore, but also for the nobles, because they would have, a slight control over the new Tsarina because of the relationships that they had had with her. So Catherine agreed. Peter III was removed from power, and then he was put in prison. He was arrested for treason. He was arrested for going against his country, especially because of what happened with the 7 Years' War and the whole Prussian uniform situation. So, as a result, Catherine was easily crowned with nobody getting in her way. She was chosen and decided to be the next Tsarina of Russia, having absolute power. She would later go on to be known as Catherine the Great. So, unfortunately for Peter, while he was in prison, just a few days later, he was brutally stabbed. So there was no way for him to come out and try to challenge Catherine's power. Turns out that even though this German princess, she wasn't even from Russia, she wound up being a wonderful ruler for Russia. She was very tough. She was very well educated and also was considered to be an enlightened despot or an enlightened ruler. She embraced all of the new technologies and the philosophies of the day. She wanted to continue actually what her predecessor Peter the Great had instituted by building up the military, expanding Russian borders, and also trying to modernize Russia as much as possible. As I mentioned, she was trying to continue to westernize Russia, just like Peter the Great had started. One of the things that she too had built, very similar to how Peter had built the city of St. Petersburg, she went on to have another building campaign, but this time building a winter palace in the city of St. Petersburg. And this is a picture of it here. You can see very much in the Baroque style. And here's a picture of it lit up at night. Here's a picture of the interior. You can see the grand staircase and the high ceilings, arches, columns, and gold leaf on the walls. And here's a picture of the outside. So just like Louis with Versailles and Frederick with Berlin and Peter with St. Petersburg, she too wanted to show off her power by building the Winter Palace. So she certainly modernized Russia as much as possible, and as an absolute ruler, she kept total control of her government with some help from the nobles, from the boyars. But again, just like under Peter, very little changed for the average Russian citizen. In fact, she actually had to put down several rebellions of serfdom. The serfs rebelled against Catherine to try to get more rights, and so that was something that she had to deal with. When she died in 1792, it is important to note, though, that most of the Russians still remained as peasants or serfs. The next ruler to end serfdom is one we will talk about at a later time. So, yes, advancing the Russian military, she actually expanded the Russian borders more than any other ruler before her, but yet serfdom still existed. So she did, even after her, the Tsar or the Tsarina, whoever was ruling Russia, did continue to have total power over all of the government. That is, in fact, is not going to change until World War I, when communism breaks out. She did begin several wars against the Ottoman Empire especially, and other nations as well. But you can see from this map the land that's highlighted down there in yellow. This was land that she was able to gain. And so, as I mentioned, that she, of all the Russian rulers, Catherine the Great was able to expand its borders more than any other. And they were very easily able to win these wars, gaining valuable territory especially in terms of natural resources, which is ultimately what they needed to help them to continue to modernize. But just like many of the other rulers we've discussed, she was enlightened. She was she was an accomplished writer. She was a poet. She was an artist. She spoke several languages. She was a musician. And she surrounded herself with many of the enlightened thinkers of the time, including Voltaire and Rousseau and others as well. Many people consider her to be the most influential ruler since Peter the Great. So even though there were several rulers between him and her, these two stand out the most as being the most influential for Russia. And that is why she is given the title Catherine the Great. She ruled for 34 years, and she made Russia into a very, very important power, really put it on the map, so to speak, helping others see that Russia is a force to be reckoned with. She died at the age of 67, probably of just natural causes. And as I mentioned, she ruled for 34 years. Her son, Paul, again, not sure who the father is, wound up becoming the new Tsar of Russia after her. We will talk about him a little bit later. But it is important to know that even though this brings an end to our absolutism unit, the winds of change are blowing throughout Europe, and those winds of change are known as the Enlightenment, which will be our next lesson. So this wraps up Age of Absolutism, and we'll do a project to kind of tie all of this together. There are no videos that you need to watch tonight. Basically, you just needed to learn about Catherine the Great and what she was able to accomplish as an absolute ruler. But that's it. Hope you all have a good night.